Beethoven's Appassionata. There are probably more recordings of this piece than there is space for in an average CD rack. And as much as we are attached to the performance of our choice, they all sound more or less the same. Except for Gould's version. For his Appassionata, Gould was both praised and bulldozed. His extremely slow tempo would be a reflection of his aversion to this piece. And although many really like the multi-layered details in Gould's version, the overall reaction was and still today remains the same. Beethoven cannot have intended this slow tempo. Indeed, Gould's version differs enormously from what is considered standard today. And because almost everyone plays this piece in about the same way, at least with more or less the same tempo in mind, most people today think that Beethoven must have wanted it more or less like that. Let me know in the comments if that is true for you as well. Even in the hip world, apart from the older pianos, the piece doesn't sound very different. So, Gould's approach is admired or denounced, yet seen by almost everyone as deviating from what Beethoven must have intended. The question is whether that is actually the case. We can take many paths to find a solution to this challenge or question, but in this video we zoom in on the additions that Ignaz Moscheles made of this piece. Moscheles, one of the first 19th century concert pianists, was a close friend of Beethoven and produced no less than 6 Beethoven editions. In the overview that Martin Norton gives, we see that Moscheles indicated 1 time 126 as the speed, compared to no less than 4 times 138. Oddly enough, none of the existing recordings come close to that. Calculating the average tempo of performances over the entire first movement, we arrive at a common tempo of about 100. Valentina Lisitsa seems, not surprisingly perhaps, the fastest of all. She, however, starts much slower, around 92, but accelerates to end at a record average of no less than 112. But 112 is still a long way from 126, let alone the speed that ultimately must have been Moscheles' preference, 138. Was Moscheles a mad piano virtuoso who just wanted to convince the world that he could play faster than all his colleagues put together? Apparently not. In 1841 he wrote the following about his Beethoven tempi.
I may be permitted to state that in superintending for Messrs. Kramer and Company the new edition of his works, and in metronomizing the several compositions, I have purposely refrained from giving way to that rapidity of pianoforte execution so largely developed at the present time.
Moscheles thus indicates that his proposed tempi are slower than what had become customary for piano virtuosos in his time. It is precisely this quote that puzzled the well-known Beethoven scholar Clive Brown. In his recent edition of the Beethoven Violin Sonatas, he quotes exactly this passage from Moscheles, but then formulates an open question that is nevertheless essential to be answered. Brown writes the following.
The last comment is curious, since Moscheles' tempos are, in general, the fastest of all.
You may indeed wonder how it is possible that Moscheles can speak of moderate tempi that no one can achieve anymore today, but apparently were taken even faster in his time. Brown didn't give us an answer to that question, but I will answer it in a bit. But first back to our question whether Beethoven had a tempo in mind that is close to the average of the many dozens of recordings we have made over the last 80 years, so around 100. The answer to this question is clearly not. Even Lisitsa remains almost 20% under tempo. But what about Gould? Gould needs no less than 15 minutes and 3 seconds for the first part. Converted to an average tempo, we get a surprising result, dotted quarter note 69. Oddly enough, that is exactly half of what Moscheles asks. So, is Gould's tempo indeed completely nonsensical and even further away from the apparent Beethoven ideal than all the other performances? I mean, half too slow? Couldn't we better be satisfied with today's Barenboims and Lisitsas and leave all of this behind? Because after all, a little too slow is better than half too slow, right? Well, that conclusion is not so easy to make. If Gould's performance is too slow, then so are all recordings of the Appassionata made in the past century. In other words, no one who has lived through the past century has ever heard this piece as it should sound, at least in the eyes or ears of Moscheles. And if Moscheles is correct, no one will ever hear it, because 138 implies that the pianist has to play 14 notes per second almost constantly. No one can do that. Not me, not you, not the crème de la crème of pianists on any instrument, modern, concert grand or pianoforte. And if you're curious how fast it would sound, 138 is something like this. But 138 is not enough. Moscheles writes clearly that the pianist in his time played Beethoven much faster. How much we don't know, let's say 30%. Then the average 19th century concert pianist would have played the Appassionata in a way that sounds a little bit like this. And yet, what Moscheles writes is not nonsensical at all. We only have to change one tiny thing to understand what he really meant: the way we use our metronome. When we use the metronome as physicists still read the pendulum today, we get a whole new reality. Each tick is then not equal to the entire note value from the metronome mark, but indicates the subdivision of that note value, just like we would count still today, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. And then Moscheles' 138 suddenly fits perfectly with Gould's 69. And for those who want to refer to Beethoven's prescription of the Allegro assai, just count the eighth notes out loud in Gould's version. You will immediately see they go pretty fast at this tempo. Allegro assai, I would say. This approach is no less than a complete paradigm shift. I'm well aware of that. Not only an understanding the thousands of metronome marks composers left that are completely ignored today, but also to you as a listener. All pieces you know and love will change, and trust me, they will change for the better. Glenn Gould certainly had no intention of reconstructing Beethoven's authentic tempo through modulus. But there was something unique about him, in that he didn't care at all about what others thought of his piano playing. On rare occasions like this, perhaps purely by instinct, he came astonishingly close to a hint of a bygone era. We could debate the details of his interpretation for a long time, but we must admit that Gould's Scandal recording may well be the most authentic of them all.